Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and drop a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The cruise was supposed to be a fresh start. Just me and my 6-year-old son, Noah, sailing away from the nightmare of my divorce that had dragged on for nearly 18 months. I had saved for this trip for almost 2 years, picking up endless hospital shifts as a nurse, dropping every overtime dollar into a jar marked New Beginnings. When we boarded in Miami on a sticky July morning in 2018, the ship looked unreal, like a floating city. It had 12 decks of glass and steel with pools, restaurants, games, and enough distractions to keep Noah busy through the entire week. The passengers seemed normal enough. Families with kids, older couples celebrating, newlyweds taking photos by the railings. Noah was bursting with excitement, clutching his backpack with his Nintendo DS and begging me every few minutes to let him try the water slides. That first day was everything I'd hoped. We explored every corner of the ship, Noah gasping at the climbing wall, the golf course, and the all-night ice cream bar. Dinner at the buffet felt like freedom. He stacked his plate with mac and cheese and cake, and I didn't even push vegetables on him. After everything he had seen through the divorce, he deserved happiness. That night, in our tiny cabin, I tucked him into the lower bunk and stared at myself in the bathroom mirror. My brown hair was already touched by sun, and for once, the dark circles under my eyes didn't look so heavy. I felt a flicker of hope. The rocking of the ship soothed me. The hum of the engines made Noah sleep deeper than he had in months. I drifted off dreaming of the snorkeling trip we had planned in Grand Cayman, imagining his face and he saw the fish. But on the second day, things changed. It began with the ship's PA system during breakfast. "Attention passengers, would young Sofia Martinez please report to guest services on deck 4? I barely noticed, sipping my coffee while Noah drowned his pancakes in syrup. 10 minutes later, another call. Christopher Johnson, 8 years old, wearing a blue Captain America shirt. That part froze me. Why mention what he was wearing? At first, I thought maybe the kids had just wandered off, but then came another call, then another. By lunchtime, I had counted 6 children's names, all between 5 and 9 years old, all with details about clothes and the last place they were seen. Yet I never once saw the children reunited with their parents. I started really watching. The pool deck was buzzing with families and kids, but some of the crew didn't seem right. They weren't serving drinks or working, they were just watching. One man, tall with acne scars, kept circling the pool, scanning faces. He wore a badge, but something about him set off every alarm I had. When Noah asked to go on the water slide alone, I heard myself snap no, even though I usually would have let him. He pouted, but I pulled him closer. Later, at the kids' club, while I filled out Noah's permission slip, a man walked up to us. He looked about 40, wearing the staff's bright yellow shirt and a crooked name tag that read Kevin. His shirt was too new, creased like it had just come out of a package. "Sorry, parents can't come. Insurance rules, but he'll have fun." The real supervisor, a young woman with a Brazilian accent, looked up. "Kevin? I don't know any Kevin, and the treasure hunt is right here, ma'am." The man didn't run. That's what scared me most. He just walked away casually and melted into the corridors. Security came, took my statement, but they acted like I was overreacting. Noah cried about missing the treasure hunt, but I couldn't calm my racing heart. I locked us inside our cabin, the flimsy chain giving me no real comfort. I made Noah play his DS while I sat on the bunk shaking. The announcements didn't stop. More names, more details. By dinner, I had written 14 children's names in my phone, but I hadn't seen a single child brought back. That night I barely slept, jumping at every sound in the hallway. Around 3 a.m., I heard muffled voices outside our door, words that made my blood run cold. "Cosmo. Tomorrow. Easier at the port. Mexican contact." Footsteps faded, but I didn't dare open the door. I stayed on the floor between Noah's bunk and the door the rest of the night, clutching the phone, ready to call security. The next morning, drained and shaking, I started talking to other parents. Most brushed me off, saying kids get lost all the time on cruises. But one mother, Jennifer, a pediatrician from Dallas, whispered that her daughter's friend saw security footage of kids being taken off the ship in Nassau by adults who weren't their parents. Staff had dismissed it as a custody dispute. Jennifer asked at guest services, but nothing was filed. The truth clicked horribly into place. The announcements weren't just for reunions, they were signals, lists. Someone was choosing kids, marking them. The ocean was lawless, ports were easy, and a ship of thousands made the perfect hunting ground. Jennifer and I promised to watch each other's kids, but I can't say new promises weren't enough. That day we were heading to Cosmo, the word I'd overheard. I told Noah I was sick and locked us in again. He didn't fight me, maybe sensing the fear I couldn't hide. We ate room service and watched movies, but the announcements continued. Each new name felt like a countdown. By day 4, Noah was restless, crying about missing the fun. Against my gut, I agreed to take him to breakfast early, when it would be quiet. At 6:30 a.m., the room was nearly empty. Noah was halfway through his cereal when I spotted him. The acne-scarred man, now in a server's uniform, standing by the juice station, watching us. Our eyes met. He smiled and started walking toward us. My stomach dropped. I stood so fast my coffee spilled. "Noah, we're leaving." But before we could, another man in a maintenance uniform stepped in front of us, holding out a toy. "Your son dropped this," he said. It wasn't Noah's toy. Behind us, the scarred man was closing in. At the exit, another figure appeared, the fake Kevin from the kids' club. They were surrounding us. I snapped. I screamed, not for help, but a raw, desperate scream that made heads whip around. I shoved Noah to the floor and yelled that he was having a seizure. People rushed over, calling for medical. In the chaos, the men melted away, disappearing into the crowd. Medics came with a wheelchair, and I kept up the act, insisting Noah had epilepsy, that I was a nurse, that we had to get to medical right away. Once inside the medical bay, behind locked doors with real security, I broke down. I told them everything. The doctor, an older British woman named Dr. Whitmore, examined Noah while the security chief stood nearby. She glanced at him, then turned back to me. "You're not the first parent," she said softly. 3 families left early at other ports after reporting the same thing. She pulled something up on her screen, then quietly turned it away. "I'll recommend immediate disembarkation for medical reasons. There's a flight from Cosmo to Miami this afternoon. Security will escort you to pack and leave the ship." Her eyes were deadly serious. "Don't stop anywhere. Don't talk to anyone. Just pack and go." 2 security officers were assigned to us, real security this time, with radios and hard faces, not like the ones who brushed me off before. While I shoved our things into bags, one stood inside the room while the other guarded the hallway. Noah kept asking why we were leaving, what was happening, and I had to lie. "Mommy's really sick, baby. We need to go home." My hands shook as I zipped the luggage, remembering all those children's names echoing through the speakers. How many of them actually made it back to their parents? The officers led us through a service elevator I never knew existed, down into the guts of the ship. The walls were bare metal, pipes rattling above our heads, the hidden places regular passengers never see. We came out at a crew exit on deck 2, where a van waited with its engine running. Just before we climbed in, the younger officer, a Filipino man who hadn't said a word until then, grabbed my arm. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Ma'am, delete any photos from the ship. Don't post anything online. These people, they've got connections everywhere. Just go home and forget this cruise ever happened." His fear was so raw, it made my knees feel weak. On the ride to the airport, I held Noah so tight he complained I was squishing him, but I couldn't let go. I kept seeing the fake Kevin's face in my head, hearing his voice tempting Noah with the arcade, how smooth and prepared they all were. We landed in Ohio that same night. The cruise line refunded everything without me even asking, which told me more than words ever could about how badly they wanted it buried. For weeks, I woke in the night, sweating, hearing those announcements in my head, names of children called out like roll call, names that might never have made it home. I filed a report with the FBI. He called every number I could find. The agent on the phone sounded tired, unsurprised. "International waters," he muttered, as though that explained it all. "We're aware of the situation. Thank you for your report." That was the end of it. No follow-up, no calls back. Jennifer, the doctor from Dallas, sent me one text to say they'd made it home safe too, then her number went dead. I never found out what happened to those kids whose names echoed through the ship. Sometimes I search for them online. Sophia Martinez missing, Christopher Johnson disappeared, but nothing ever comes up. It's like they never even existed. Noah doesn't remember much now, thank God for that. He just thinks we went home early because Mommy got sick, but I remember every second. I remember how those men blended into the crowd, moving like they belonged, hunting with no rush, no fear. Thousands of families all around, and still, they slipped through like shadows. Even now, when I'm at a mall or an amusement park, if I hear a child's name on the loudspeaker, my body locks up cold. My eyes scan the crowd for men watching too closely, smiling too wide, wearing uniforms that don't quite fit. The Atlantic was rougher than usual that September, and by nightfall, most passengers had already disappeared into their cabins. I had been on this ship for 3 days, one of those mid-sized liners that runs from New York to Southampton. Nothing flashy, but comfortable enough. My cabin sat on deck 7, a plain room with a porthole that stayed fogged from the clash of cold ocean air and heated ship interiors. After 8 years with the Boston PD and another 2 running my own security consulting firm, I had learned to notice what didn't belong. My sister practically forced me onto this trip after my divorce was finalized, saying a week at sea might help me let go of my habits. Stop scanning surveillance footage, stop chasing threats no one else saw. She was right for a while. The first days were dull in the best way. Bland food at the buffet, a comedian who got one laugh out of me, long hours watching the endless horizon rise and sink. But night 3, everything shifted. It was around 11:30 in the main lounge. I was at the bar with a glass of bourbon, watching the young bartender Anton, a Romanian kid barely 25, trying to keep up with drunken passengers. Then the shouting broke out near the casino entrance. 2 men in their 40s, both dressed in expensive clothes, but the kind of expensive that didn't fit them, like it had been bought for show. The bigger man had shoulders that strained the seams of his blazer. When he shoved the smaller one, it wasn't just anger, it was staged, deliberate. The smaller man tumbled into a table of women playing cards, scattering chips, and spilling drinks everywhere. And then I noticed the detail that made every instinct sharpen. 3 other men across the lounge stood up at the exact same second. They didn't look shocked like the others. They weren't rushing to help. They were moving with a plan, closing in like a net. Chaos spread fast, but in less than a minute, it was clear this wasn't a fight. It was an ambush. The 3 newcomers pulled knives, not pocket knives, not kitchen blades, but ceramic, the kind that don't trigger metal detectors. One scarred man with a shaved head went straight for the women's purses and jewelry. Another slipped behind the bar where Anton froze in place. The third planted himself at the exit. The bigger man, the one who started the fight, now pressed a blade to the smaller man's throat while ripping off his watch, a Patek Philippe worth more than most cars. Passengers hadn't started screaming yet. It was too fast, too surreal. I didn't have a gun. I knew better than to bring one onto a cruise ship, but I always carried my tactical pen. And on the bar was a heavy glass ashtray, one of the few still around, even though smoking was banned. I snatched it up and brought it down on the wrist of the man threatening Anton. The sound of bone snapping cut through the noise. His knife clattered to the floor, and Anton, bless him, reacted instantly. He smashed a vodka bottle across the guy's head, dropping him. But I made a mistake. I bent to grab the fallen knife, and when I rose, the scarred man was already charging, his blade angled low and fast, like someone who had done this 100 times. By then, the room had erupted, people screaming, tables crashing, glasses shattering. The scarred man's jabs forced me back toward the window, the black ocean visible beyond. I managed to block him twice, the ceramic knife heavy in my hand, but he was trained. He feinted left, then slashed right, tearing across my forearm. Blood soaked my sleeve, hot and sharp, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind him, I saw the bigger man dragging the wealthy target toward a service door, blade still at his throat, while another stuffed wallets and jewelry into a bag. They were working fast, methodical, like they'd done this exact thing before. I kicked a chair into the scarred man's path, buying myself 2 seconds to grab a champagne bottle from an abandoned table. When he came at me again, I swung it like a baseball bat, hitting his shoulder and spinning him into the piano. That's when ship security finally showed up. 2 officers in white uniforms stood in the doorway, looking like they'd only handled drunks before. They had batons, but no guns, and they froze for a beat, trying to understand the chaos. The attackers didn't hesitate. The one at the exit whistled sharp and loud, like calling a dog, and they all moved at once, dropping victims and loot and spreading toward different doors with practiced speed. The scarred man rolled away from the piano, clutching his shoulder, but he wasn't done. He slipped through a crew-only door. The big guy shoved his hostage to the floor and vanished through the service entrance he'd been heading toward. In 15 seconds, the lounge looked wrecked. Blood on the carpet, glass everywhere, people hiding behind overturned chairs. I stood there with a slashed arm and a broken champagne bottle, trying to tell security this wasn't just a bad bar fight. They took me to the medical center on deck 3. Dr. Kovac, a neat Hungarian woman with gray hair pulled tight into a bun, stitched my arm while I tried to explain to the head of security what we'd seen. Captain Morrison finally arrived 20 minutes later, still buttoning his jacket. I walked him through it. The ceramic knives, the timing, how the men fled through crew exits and that they hit specific rich passengers. These weren't random thieves. They'd studied the ship, planned escape routes, and picked targets. Morrison went white when I said ceramic knives. "Those don't show up on our scanners," he muttered. Dr. Kovac paused mid-stitch when I described how focused the attackers had been, each man moving with purpose, like they had been told exactly where to go. "How many passengers boarded in New York?" I asked. Morrison pulled a tablet and scrolled. 837, he said. "We check passports, but we don't photograph everyone." I convinced him to pull the security footage from embarkation day. We spent the next 3 hours cramped behind the bridge, watching grainy videos on old monitors. Anton, the bartender who'd insisted on helping, had an eye for faces. He potted the 5 men first. They'd boarded separately within a 30-minute window, each carrying a similar black bag and walking with the same controlled gait I'd seen in the lounge. They quickly spread out, no obvious contact between them, but the timing was too neat to be coincidence. We tracked them on cameras for the next 2 days. They ate in different restaurants, used different pools, never seen together. But Anton noticed something else. All 5 had cabins on deck 2, the cheap interior rooms, all in the same corridor. Who books 5 separate interior cabins on a transatlantic? I asked Morrison to check bookings. All 5 reservations were made on the same day 6 weeks earlier, all paid with prepaid cards and different travel agencies, but the booking reference numbers were in order. Morrison wanted to search their rooms right away, but I stopped him. If they knew we were onto them, they might panic. We were in the middle of the Atlantic, nowhere to run, but nowhere for passengers to hide either. I suggested we watch them first. The captain agreed and put his best security officers on those corridors. For the next 18 hours, the suspects didn't leave their rooms. No room service, no hallway trips, nothing. It was like they had disappeared inside those cabins. Then Anton, digging through dining records, found something odd. Over the past 2 nights, someone had charged huge amounts of food at the midnight buffet, enough for 15 people, and billed it to a cabin belonging to an elderly couple from Vermont, the Andersons, who ate in the main dining room every night. Security checked buffet footage and saw the big guy from the fight loading plates at 2 in the morning, then slipping toward a service elevator. The pieces fit together when Morrison pulled up the ship's blueprints. The service elevator by the buffet led to a maintenance corridor that ran behind the row of deck 2 cabins where the suspects stayed. That corridor also ran straight to the ship's storage hold, the place the line used to keep passenger valuables in safety deposit boxes. The crews advertised it as a secure service for folks traveling with jewelry or cash. Morrison's face went pale when I told him what I thought. "There's probably $3 million worth of items in that hold," he whispered. The lounge attack hadn't been the main crime. It was a trial run, a way to see how security reacted and to test exit times. They were planning a bigger job, and we were already on day 4 of a 7-day crossing. We had a short refuel stop in the Azores in about 36 hours, then Southampton. If they'd target the storage hold, they'd move the goods just before the Azores and slip into the islands before anyone noticed. We had less than 36 hours to stop them. Morrison talked about calling the Coast Guard and getting military help, but that would take too long and tip off our suspects. I proposed something riskier, let them think they're invisible, and set a trap. That night, we'd quietly move all the real valuables out of the storage hold, replace them with fake jewelry and empty boxes, and wait for the thieves to make their move. Morrison hesitated. Liability alone could ruin him, but he knew options were limited. So that night, while most passengers attended the captain's formal dinner, Morrison, Anton, 2 trusted security officers, and I quietly emptied the storage hold. We packed everything into the captain's personal safe and 3 secured crew lockers, taking pictures of every piece for insurance. Anton had a cousin working in the ship's theater, and we borrowed costume jewelry, spray pea, painted rocks to look like gold bars, even stuffed some boxes with poker chips from the casino. By 4 in the morning, the storage hold looked exactly the same as before, but now it held nothing worth more than a few dollars. The waiting was the worst part. 28 long hours dragged by with no sign of movement from their cabins. My head kept turning over the same question. Had I been wrong? Maybe I imagined it all. Then, at 3:15 a.m. on our last night before the Azores, the fire alarm shrieked from the kitchen. supposedly a grease fire needing every crew member. Except I had been watching the kitchen cameras and there was no fire. Someone had pulled the alarm on purpose. Morrison and I stayed hidden inside a maintenance closet near the storage hold while panic spread through the decks above us. Through the small vent in the door, we heard them. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving fast but controlled. They used a keycard they should never have had, opening the hold like it belonged to them. We waited until all 5 men were inside. Then Morrison hit the emergency lockdown he'd set up earlier. The magnetic locks slammed shut with a heavy click, trapping them inside with nothing but junk. When security opened the door 20 minutes later, the 5 men stood in the middle of scattered costume jewelry and painted rocks, their canvas bags half filled with fake gold bars. The scarred one actually laughed when he saw what we'd done, shaking his head like he admired the trick. 6 hours later, Portuguese police were waiting when we docked in the Azores, and the FBI boarded at Southampton with a warrant for the entire crew. That's when we found out the truth. These men were part of a Romanian crime ring that had already hit 3 other cruise lines in the last 2 years. Always the same plan. Fake names, a staged distraction, then rob the ship's valuables before vanishing. At the next port. The FBI agent told me they'd stolen more than $12 million total, choosing long transatlantic crossings where security was weaker and passengers carried more jewelry and cash. The ceramic knives were custom-made in Prague, designed to slip past scanners. But the detail that chilled me most was learning they hadn't worked alone. Someone inside the company was feeding them information, wealthy passengers, cabin numbers, and security routines. They caught the insider the day after we docked, a reservations crew member trying to board a flight to Bucharest. Morrison offered me the job of head of security for the cruise line, but I refused. The ocean might look beautiful, but I'd had enough of being trapped in a floating metal cage with criminals who treated it like their hunting ground. Anton later testified at the trial and used the reward money to open his own bar back in Boston. He named it the Ceramic Knife, which I told him was awful branding, but he only laughed. Sometimes I stop by for a drink, and we sit in the corner remembering how close those men came to pulling off the perfect heist. My arm healed with only a pale scar that still aches when it rains. Now whenever I see a glossy cruise ship ad, I wonder if people realize what they're really signing up for, locking themselves inside a city on the sea with strangers, praying those strangers are exactly who they pretend to be. The afternoon sun was beating down on the pool deck when everything changed again. I was 38 then, managing a hardware store in Phoenix, and we had saved for 2 years to finally afford this trip. Me, my wife Lisa, our teenage daughter Madison, and my dad Walter. He had just retired at 65 from the post office after 4 decades. A man who never traveled, always saying he'd wait until retirement. We surprised him with this cruise for his birthday, second day at sea, to heading toward Jamaica. For once, Dad was actually relaxed, smiling as Madison tried to teach him shuffleboard. His face burned red even under all the sunscreen Lisa kept forcing on him. I remember the moment clearly because Madison had just scored her first point and was dancing around when Dad's shuffleboard stick slipped from his hands. He clutched his chest with one hand, gripping that silly Hawaiian shirt with parrots that Madison had bought for him. His face drained from sunburn red to a terrible gray in seconds. He tried to speak, but only a broken gasp came out before his knees gave. I caught him before he hit the deck, his weight dragging me down. His eyes were wide, terrified, his hands clawing at his chest like he was trying to tear something out. Lisa screamed for help while Madison stood frozen, still holding her shuffleboard stick, not understanding what she was seeing. A crew member in a white uniform rushed over in less than a minute, though it felt like hours, and called for medical on his radio. They brought a wheelchair, but Dad was too weak, slumping forward, gasping with awful wheezes. We carried him, me under his arms, the crew member holding his legs, while Lisa ran ahead, pushing through sunbathers who stopped to stare. The medical center was down on deck 2, tucked behind the photo gallery where they sold overpriced snapshots of boarding passengers. The smell hit me first, not sterile like a hospital, but damp and musty, like mildew covered with cheap air freshener. The waiting room had 3 cracked plastic chairs and a dusty water cooler with an empty jug. The doctor, if he even was one, introduced himself as Dr. Petrov, thick Eastern European accent, maybe 28, 30 at most. Acne scars, cheap scrubs faded thin. The nurse with him, Carla from the Philippines, at least seemed competent. She moved quickly, getting Dad onto an XSA bench bolted to the wall. Petrov pressed a stethoscope to Dad's chest, the device looking older than me, and then turned to us with a casual shrug. "Is probable cardiac event," he said flatly, like he was diagnosing a cold. "We give aspirin, monitor, next port 10, maybe 12 hours. He's stable enough." But Dad didn't look stable. His lips had gone bluish, his hands still clawing at his chest, tears of pain streaking down his face. Lisa snapped then, grabbing Petrov's scrubs, screaming about helicopters, about the Coast Guard, about doing something real instead of watching her father die. Petrov just blinked, frozen, while Carla gently pulled Lisa away. "Ma'am, please," Carla said softly, her voice calm but her eyes sharp with fear. "Helicopter cost minimum $50,000, insurance no cover, need corporate approval, 5 hours for paperwork." She showed us the supply cabinet as if to reassure us. Inside were scraps, bandages, faded bottles with unreadable labels, a single ancient oxygen tank, and an EKG machine patched together with tape. Its screen cracked. Dad started vomiting violently, crying out each time his body convulsed. Petrov looked panicked, fumbling with the oxygen mask, the elastic snapping as he tried to stretch it. He had to hold it in place with his hands while Carla dug for tape. I asked for nitroglycerin, clot-busting drugs, anything. Petrov just shook his head. "We no stock, too costly, expire too quick, corporate policy." In the corner sat a defibrillator covered in dust, a note taped to it. "Out of order, awaiting parts." Madison was sobbing, calling her grandfather's name. Dad's breathing turned worse, every inhale sounding like he was drowning. The next 3 hours felt endless. We held the oxygen mask to his face because the tape kept slipping. Carla checked his pulse by hand since the monitor was dead and waiting for replacement parts. Petrov disappeared for an hour, and when he came back, he smelled of cigarettes and wouldn't look us in the eye. Around the second hour, Dad's body seized, rigid, eyes rolling back, lasting 20, 30 seconds at a time. After the third episode, even Petrov's mask of calm cracked. He admitted he'd only been on cruise ships for 3 months. Before that, 2 years as a general practitioner in Romania, mostly handling colds and stomach aches. The cruise line had hired him because he was cheap. I'll never forget the cruise director arriving around the 4th hour. Gregory, something like that. A tanned man in his 40s with 2 white veneers, wearing a uniform glittering with fake gold trim, more like a costume than command. He came in while Dad was in the middle of another attack, waited like it was just some small annoyance, then gave this cold, rehearsed speech about rules and law. "Your father signed a waiver when he boarded," he said, holding up his phone to show the fine print no one ever bothers to read. Section 47B said clearly that the ship's medical care was limited and passengers traveled at their own risk. Lisa broke down crying harder, and instead of helping, he offered us a 20% discount on our next cruise and free drink packages for the rest of this trip. I wanted to throw him out the nearest porthole, but I couldn't leave Dad's side. His skin had faded from gray to almost see-through, his veins jumping under his skin, sometimes racing fast, sometimes barely moving at all. By the 6th hour, a small crowd had formed outside the medical center door. People were recording on their phones through the glass. One woman even knocked and asked if we could quiet down because there was a comedy show going on nearby. That was the moment I snapped. I stormed out and told them everything. How the defibrillator didn't work, how they refused to call for an emergency rescue, how the doctor admitted he wasn't really trained for this. People started posting online immediately. Within the hour, the man returned, this time with the captain, Eriksson, a tall Norwegian with a stiff face. He at least looked guilty, but his words were worse. They said they'd finally call for an evacuation, but only if we signed papers clearing the company of all blame and agreed to pay everything up front. They had a card machine ready, demanding a $50,000 deposit. Madison, shaking but sharper than any of us, used the ship's Wi-Fi, $15 for 30 minutes, even in this nightmare, to email every news station she could find. She sent out photos of the broken gear, Gregory's speech about waivers, even a shot of the dead defibrillator. CNN actually called back within 20 minutes, and suddenly the captain's phone was buzzing non-stop. The cruise line's headquarters was in full panic. They finally agreed to send the helicopter, but it had already been over 7.5 hours. Dad had stopped seizing, which the nurse whispered wasn't good. He barely responded to our voices, and his pulse was so faint she had to check his neck instead of his wrist. When the helicopter came at hour 9, the nightmare only grew. The elevators weren't working, so 6 crew carried him up 4 decks on a stretcher patched with duct tape. Halfway up, one of the handles snapped and a young kid barely held Dad's weight with his shoulder. The wind on the top deck howled as the helicopter circled, unable to land because the pad hadn't been certified in 3 years. They had to lower a swinging rescue basket. Watching them strap his limp body inside, swaying 30 feet above the sea, was the most terrifying sight of my life. Lisa turned away, sobbing, while Madison filmed everything, saying she wanted proof in case something went wrong. Dad barely survived. The doctors in Fort Lauderdale said if it had been another hour, he would have died. He'd suffered a massive heart attack, and the 9 hours without real treatment had done permanent harm. His heart now only worked at 30%. He spent the 3 weeks in intensive care, went through triple bypass surgery, and even now, 2 years later, he can't climb a single flight of stairs without stopping. The bills hit $400,000, and the cruise line fought us on every charge, saying we delayed his care by going to the media. We're still in court, though Dad's alive, barely. The company never admitted fault, just released a polished statement about reviewing medical standards. Petrov, the so-called doctor, still works for them, just on a different ship. Madison found him online, posting smiling photos like nothing ever happened. They did fix the broken defibrillator, though. They bragged about that in their press release, claiming it showed their commitment to passenger safety. I was 22 then and had never been on anything bigger than my uncle's small fishing boat in Colorado. But there I was, standing on deck 7 of this massive ship, watching the Mexican coastline fade into black, while 4,000 strangers laughed and partied around me. I'd worked 2 years waiting tables in a greasy Denver diner, stacking double shifts, telling myself every aching step would be worth it when I finally stepped onto that shining ocean palace. My roommate Ashley called me crazy for going alone, said I should wait until she could come too, but I couldn't. I needed to prove to myself that I could do something big without anyone holding my hand. The first 2 days were magic, snorkeling at port, meeting other solo travelers, drowning in shrimp at the buffet. By the 3rd night, I decided to splurge at the steakhouse, the one you had to pay extra for, $70 just to get in. The place glowed with tall windows over the water, candlelit tables, and servers who remembered your name after hearing it once. My waiter, Dominic, with a heavy Italian accent, told me the ribeye with herb butter was the best cut they had had in weeks. When it arrived, I couldn't help myself. I snapped 5 photos before touching it. The steak was thick as a dictionary, edges charred black, center bleeding pink, swimming in green butter speckled with garlic and rosemary. That first bite tasted strange, sharp and metallic on my tongue, but Dominic just smiled and said it was normal, part of the aging process. The couple next to me, the Brennans from Wisconsin, were celebrating 40 years together. Mr. Brennan joked that his steak was so good he might leave his wife for the chef. We laughed, swapped stories, and I finished every bite, sopping up the melted butter with the bread. Around midnight, I woke up with my stomach twisting like I'd missed a step on the stairs, and my whole body lurched. The room was dark, only a thin slice of moonlight slipping through the balcony door, and the ship rocked harder than usual, making it worse. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I'd just overeaten or mixed too many foods and drinks, but then a sharp pain gripped just under my ribs, twisting like someone wringing out my insides. I barely made it to the cramped bathroom before everything came back up. The steak, the potatoes, the mojitos I'd had earlier. My throat burned, my body shaking and dripping cold sweat. The vomiting kept coming, wave after wave that left me clinging to the toilet. And then I noticed something that made me freeze with panic. The vomit wasn't just food. It had this dark, coffee-like grit and red streaks I knew weren't from anything I'd eaten. I tried calling guest services from the phone by the bed, but it just rang and rang. No answer. My cabin mate, Bethany from Oregon, wasn't back yet, probably still partying on deck 12. I shoved on flip-flops, grabbed my key, and staggered out, one hand clutching my stomach, the other trailing the wall. The hallway stretched forever, lined with the same dizzying carpet. That made my nausea worse. Every few steps I had to stop, leaning into the wall, trying not to collapse. The infirmary was on deck 2, so I dragged myself toward the elevator. As I waited, I heard someone retching behind a cabin door. Then another sound from farther down. The horrible gagging echoed through the quiet halls. When the elevator finally came, 3 people were already inside, all looking as awful as I felt. A man in a Disney shirt bent over the rail, skin a sickly green-gray. A woman sat in the corner clutching an ice bucket full of bile, her mascara streaked down her cheeks. A teenage boy leaned against the wall, legs shaking uncontrollably. Nobody spoke. We just endured the ride as the elevator crawled down, stopping at every floor to pick up more sick passengers. By deck 4, a dozen of us were jammed inside. The air reeked of vomit, sweat, and dread. An old woman whispered, "This isn't right. This isn't right," clutching a rosary with trembling hands. When the doors opened on deck 2, the sight hit me like a nightmare. The hallway to the infirmary was packed with bodies, a line stretching all the way back toward the crew quarters. 60, maybe 70 people, all pale and broken. Some sat slumped on the floor with heads between their knees. Others swayed on their feet, gripping the walls or each other for balance. I spotted Mrs. Brennan, the kind woman from dinner, vomiting into a trash bag while her husband rubbed her back, though his own face was soaked with sweat. Parents carried limp children. A pregnant woman cried while her partner fanned her with a brochure, and near the front, a man lay unconscious while his wife screamed for help. The smell was suffocating, vomit, waste, and underneath it all a metallic tang that made me think of my steak. I slid down against the wall at the back of the line, hugging my knees. The woman beside me, still due, reached for some formal dinner, said she'd been waiting 2 hours already. 2 hours? She whispered the infirmary only had 1 doctor and 2 nurses drowning under the flood of sick. People who'd made it inside said they were all being given the same thing, some cheap anti-nausea pills, and sent back to their rooms. No fluids, no care, just pills. Her husband had gone to hunt for water since room service had stopped answering, and the nearest working fountain was 3 decks up. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. When she tried to shift, her legs gave out and she crashed to the floor. Another hour passed, barely moving. Then a crewman in a white uniform forced his way through. Desperate hands grabbed at him, begging for help, but he kept his head down. At the infirmary door, he whispered fast into his radio in a language I didn't know, but I caught 3 words in English: containment, corporate, blackout. The doors opened just long enough for him to slip inside, and in that blink I saw the chaos within. Gurneys lined up, patients on IVs, a nurse rushing between them, the doctor arguing with a man in a business suit. The suit waved papers, pointing at the sick like they were numbers, not people. Then the doors shut again, and we were left in the hallway. My vision blurred, the edges darkened as my mouth dried out like sandpaper. The woman next to me stopped responding to anyone, just stared at the ceiling with glassy eyes. When I tried to stand, my legs folded, sending me crashing sideways. A young crew member crouched by me. He looked scared but pressed a half-empty bottle of water into my hands. In hushed, broken English, he told me to go back to my cabin immediately. He said the restaurant on deck 7, the one where I'd eaten, had a freezer break 2 days ago, but management forced them to serve the spoiled meat anyway. Over 300 people had eaten it. He whispered that corporate was flying in their own doctors the next morning, but tonight we were under strict orders to receive as little care as possible, so there'd be no record for lawsuits. Before I could ask more, his supervisor appeared shouting, and the boy hurried off. His words echoed in my head. Broken freezer, 300 sick, cover up. I started noticing details I'd missed. Crew drank only sealed, bottled water, never from the taps. Security guards wore masks, something I'd never seen on a ship. And then I spotted 2 passengers from first class. Ones I'd seen at the captain's table, being quietly escorted through a side door, straight into the infirmary. No waiting. The woman next to me saw it too. Tears ran down her face, not from sickness, but from rage. She tried to yell, to warn everyone, but her voice was a raw whisper. By 5 in the morning, I'd been in that hallway for nearly 5 hours when things changed. The man in the suit came out with security and began checking people's room keys. When he got to me, he frowned at his tablet and told the guards to take me back to my cabin. I tried to protest, begged for help, but he only gave this cold smile and said the doctor decided I was fit enough to recover in my room. I was too weak to fight as they dragged me toward the elevator. Behind me, I heard him giving the same order to others, clearing the hall by force. The pregnant woman's sobs echoed down the corridor as she begged them not to leave her behind. The man who had collapsed earlier was now being wheeled away on a luggage cart, his wife stumbling behind him, begging someone to help. But nobody even tried anymore. They shoved me back into my cabin like I was baggage and told me to stay there until further notice. Said room service would bring me crackers and electrolyte drinks within an hour. But nothing came. Not a knock, not a tray, not even a glass of water. Bethany, my roommate, was curled up on her bed, her sheets drenched in sweat. She'd been sick too. She told me she'd tried to get to the infirmary around 3 in the morning but never made it. Passing out in the elevator. Another passenger had dragged her back and left her here. For the next 18 hours, we took turns throwing up in the bathroom, trading off what was left of a single bottle of water, and listening to the muffled chaos outside in the hallway as more people collapsed and groaned. Later, after we finally docked in Mexico, I learned that 43 passengers were rushed straight to the hospital. 7 ended up in intensive care. 2 elderly people actually died during that nightmare night at sea. The cruise line's response was insulting. They gave us a slip of paper offering a 25% discount on another cruise if we signed documents promising silence. No talking to the press, no lawsuits, no social media. Most people signed because they just wanted off that ship, that floating coffin. I refused, which is why I'm able to tell you what happened. The ship was the Royal Atlantic Ventures vessel, the Paradise Queen, sailing out of Galveston on March 15, 2022. I thought my years as a firefighter in Chicago had prepared me for anything, but I was wrong. I'd survived burning buildings, collapsing stairwells, and smoke thick enough to blind, yet none of that came close to what I faced last April on another cruise ship, the Celestial Dream. My daughter Megan convinced me to go. She said I needed to relax, to see the world beyond fire trucks and sirens. She practically forced me onto that Mediterranean cruise, even drove me to the airport herself to make sure I went. The ship was a monster of steel and glass, carrying over 2,000 passengers, with 8 restaurants, 3 pools, and endless distractions. 4 days into the trip, I was finally letting myself enjoy it. I'd even joined a shuffleboard group with some retirees from Michigan. The weather had been picture perfect, the sea calm, like polished glass. That all changed one afternoon. I was heading back to my cabin after lunch when I noticed something strange. Through the porthole, the horizon had turned a bruised purple, the kind of color you don't forget. Minutes later, the captain's voice came over the speakers, calm but a little too careful, telling us to expect rough seas and to secure loose items in our rooms. The crew, though, their faces told another story. They weren't strolling, they were moving with a tense kind of speed, the kind of movement you only recognize if you've worked emergency response. Within half an hour, the ship began to rock in slow, unnatural motions, making cups and plates slide across tables. When I stepped out to the balcony, my stomach dropped. The waves weren't waves anymore. They were mountains, walls of water that looked tall enough to swallow the whole ship. The sky had gone from purple to black, clouds sagging so low you could almost touch them. Other passengers were still laughing, still snapping photos, as if this was entertainment. I knew better. Old habits kicked in. I stuffed my passport, wallet, and medicine into a waterproof pouch and kept it close. Tried to call Megan, but the signal was breaking up. Managed to send her one short text. Rough weather, I'm fine. By 4 o'clock, they'd closed all the decks and ordered everyone back to their cabins. But I couldn't stay trapped in that small room with water pounding against the glass. I went to the main dining hall instead, a huge space on deck 5 with crystal chandeliers and wide windows stretching wall to wall. There were maybe 30 passengers inside, scattered, trying to eat dinner while their plates slid like air hockey pucks across the tables. That's when it hit. The first true wave. The entire ship groaned and heaved sideways with such force that the grand piano on stage tore free and rolled across the room like it was made of cardboard, smashing into the wall with a sickening crash. The room exploded into chaos. People screamed as tables flipped, glass shattered, and passengers were thrown like dolls. Food, broken plates, and chairs all tumbled together in a deadly mess. An elderly woman near me was hurled from her chair and slid 15 feet across the floor before hitting a pillar with a sound that made my blood run cold. Her husband scrambled after her, fighting against the angle of the ship, which tilted so steeply it felt like the walls had become the floor. Then came the alarm. Not the calm voice of the captain, but a shrill, piercing electronic wail. It mixed with the sounds of terror, shouts, and the endless crashing of things breaking loose. I clung to a support column and pulled a young couple with me, just as another wave slammed from the other side. The ship moaned deep in its bones, the metallic groan of something massive straining against the impossible. The lights flickered out and came back dim, casting everything in a yellow glow that made faces look ghostly. Through the windows there was no horizon anymore, only black water pressing in like the sea itself had decided to climb on board. A crew member stumbled in, his forehead bleeding, his white uniform torn. He was yelling for life jackets, pointing toward the emergency stations, but most people couldn't even stand up. The ship rocked so violently that every surface became a trap. Then, as if to prove none of us were safe, a massive wave struck broadside. For a moment, it looked like it froze against the glass, pressing there, before shattering through. Freezing water rushed across the dining hall, swallowing everything in its path. Passengers screamed as they were swept into tables, chairs floated, and I heard someone shouting that water was pouring up from the stairwells below. The ship tilted farther, so far you had to cling to anything bolted down or slide helplessly toward Jim. The flooding water, it felt less like being at sea and more like being dragged into the mouth of something alive, something determined to pull us under. Every time the ship slammed into another wave, you could hear things breaking somewhere deep inside its belly. Not small things, heavy, important machinery snapping apart like bones. I fought my way to the life jacket station, grabbing the orange vests and tossing them to anyone I could reach while trying not to slip on the floor, which had turned into a rushing river of seawater, broken glass, and floating trash. Near me was a family from the Midwest, 2 teenagers pressed against their parents behind an overturned table. The father's arm bent the wrong way, the mother pressing a bloody napkin to her daughter's leg. I helped them into their jackets, pulled the straps tight, and that's when the captain's voice boomed through the speakers again. But this time he wasn't calm. He was shouting, "This is not a drill. All passengers and crew to muster stations immediately. I repeat, this is not a drill." It was the fear in his voice that hit hardest. Captains aren't supposed to sound afraid, and hearing it made the storm feel even worse. We tried to move together toward the muster station, but another massive wave slammed us, and suddenly the lights cut out completely. 10 seconds of darkness that felt like an eternity. Water surged around our legs, people screamed, and bodies crashed into one another in the dark. When the emergency lights flickered back on, the dining hall was half submerged, water already up to our waists, climbing higher every minute. Through the shattered windows, the sea outside rose like walls, 40, 50 feet high, mountains of black water crowned with white, lifting the ship as if we were a toy before hurling it back down. An older man beside me started to panic, gasping that his wife was still trapped in their cabin on deck 3. He tried to run back, but I grabbed him and held him because we could all hear it, the roar of water pouring into the lower decks, doors slamming open and closed, and the long groan of metal bending past its limits. Reaching the muster station felt like being trapped in one of those nightmares where your legs don't work. We had to claw along the walls while the ship tilted, sliding down when it righted, all while fighting through freezing, waist-deep water. A woman was torn from her husband's grip and swept toward the broken windows. 3 of us locked arms to drag her back, her face pale and choking up seawater. The crew looked just as lost as us. Kids barely out of training who had probably only practiced safety drills in calm seas now faced a sinking ship. One young woman with a heavy accent was crying, clutching what used to be a clipboard that had turned to mush in the water. Mascara streaked her face while she whispered the safety instructions like they were prayers. By the time we reached the muster station on deck 4, things had gone beyond disaster. The lifeboats swung wildly as the ship pitched, smashing into the steel hull. I watched one tear apart like a soda can, flattened in seconds, and it hit me cold. There might not be enough boats left to save us all. People surged forward, shoving, clawing, families torn apart in the chaos. I saw a man knock an elderly woman to the ground just to push ahead. Civilization peeled away, replaced by survival. The storm screamed all around us. Wind howled so loud you had to yell into someone's ear to be heard. Rain cut sideways like knives. Every wave that crashed over the deck swept passengers off their feet, dragging them toward the rails, some over into the black ocean below. Then came the sound, the one that made even the crew stop in place. A massive metallic shriek from deep below, followed by a violent shudder through the whole ship. The deck tilted past 45 degrees and didn't come back. People slid screaming across the deck in tangled heaps, life jackets bobbing as some vanished overboard. I wrapped both arms around a steel pole, legs dangling, staring in horror as the horizon spun sideways. The ship was rolling. Slowly, inevitably, the entire liner was turning over. Water was everywhere now, not just waves crashing in, but jets shooting up through drains, floods pouring down staircases, geysers exploding from cracks in the floor. The engines below wailed like dying animals. For 30 long seconds, the ship hovered on the edge of capsizing, 2,000 souls holding their breath, praying, whispering in a dozen languages as the storm screamed around us. Then, against all odds, the vessel began to drag itself back upright, metal grinding, stabilizers groaning, the captain forcing every bit of strength the ship had left to keep it afloat. Slowly, sickeningly, the deck leveled, though nothing felt safe anymore. A crewman shouted into his radio. The Greek Coast Guard was 8 miles away, helicopters already in the air, rescue ships pushing through the storm toward us. But 8 miles in seas like this felt like another world away. For 3 endless hours, we clung to survival. We hauled the injured, made human chains to keep people from washing overboard, used anything we could find to scoop water out. The ship sagged lower with every hour, but somehow, impossibly, it stayed afloat. Then, through the storm, a helicopter's searchlight pierced the night, a blinding beam of salvation cutting through black rain. People screamed with relief, fell to their knees sobbing. Rescue began, but it was slow. Injured and elderly lifted first, baskets swinging wildly in the wind as helicopters hovered like fragile toys above the storm. I stayed to help, steadying panicked passengers, pushing them forward when fear froze them. The water licked higher along the deck, every second heavier. 14 hours it took to evacuate everyone, trip after trip, until at last it was my turn. From the rescue ship, shivering under a blanket, I watched the celestial dream lit in harsh floodlights, the liner broken and bleeding water from every seam. And then, just after dawn, it finally gave in, sinking beneath the waves. They called it a miracle that no one died, though 43 were hospitalized and hundreds more carried injuries that didn't make the news. They flew us to Athens, gave us hotel rooms, and the cruise line sent in their polished representatives with soft voices and paperwork, offering money and free cruises that no one in that room would ever accept. 2 days later, I was back in Chicago. Megan was waiting at O'Hare, crying so hard she could barely see me. She wrapped her arms around me like she thought I'd vanish if she let go. She'd seen the footage, the helicopters hovering over a ship that looked like it should already have been at the bottom of the sea, passengers clinging for their lives. And she kept apologizing for pushing me to go, which shattered me, because none of it was her fault. As the ship prepared to dock, Paul and I stood on the upper deck, watching as 3 crew members were quietly led off through a service gangway, not the main exit with the rest of us. They weren't in uniform anymore, just plain clothes, carrying duffel bags, trying hard to blend in with the dock workers. But I knew one of them. She was the woman I'd seen with Dimitri the night before, the one who had been speaking Portuguese on the radio. When some of us tried to leave the ship to file a police report, we were suddenly told that passengers from Deck 7 were under a temporary restriction because of administrative issues. The hotel director himself came down, smiling too much, explaining it was for our own protection while they worked with the proper authorities. But Janet had slipped out through a crew exit, determined to get help. She made it to the police station, only to be told the cruise line had already reported a minor theft, claiming it was being handled internally. Because of maritime law, the officers said they couldn't do anything unless she proved physical harm had occurred on U.S. soil. They didn't even want to hear her statement. She caught one of them muttering about not disrupting tourism relations since the cruise company brought too much money into their port. That night, as we sailed away from St. Thomas, Frank called a documentation party in his suite. Around 20 of us showed up, carrying whatever we had. Photos of smashed doors, recordings of strange radio chatter caught on phones, screenshots of crew members' suspicious posts online, and written notes of what we'd all seen. Dorothy, a paralegal from Indiana, helped everyone write detailed statements with times and descriptions. Frank pulled out a military-grade satellite phone he'd kept locked away in a Pelican case and used it to upload everything to a secure cloud, emailing copies to the FBI, the Coast Guard, and several news outlets. Not long after, there was a knock on the door. The hotel director appeared with 4 security guards, and of course, Dimitri was one of them. They claimed they'd gotten a noise complaint, reminding us that gatherings of more than 10 passengers in one cabin were against regulations. They tried to take our phones and cameras, insisting they needed them as evidence for an internal investigation. But Frank refused, standing firm, telling them they had no right to confiscate personal property without a warrant and that trying would make them thieves themselves. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. For the next 3 days, the ship felt like a standoff. They couldn't throw us off without drawing attention, and we couldn't make them properly investigate their own people. But things shifted when we finally docked back in Port Canaveral. Waiting at the gangway were 2 FBI agents and a Coast Guard investigator. Because of Frank's connections and the evidence we'd sent, 17 passengers from Deck 7 filed official complaints. Paul leaked the story to a tech journalist friend with a massive Twitter following, and soon the local news picked it up too. The cruise line tried to spin it as a one-off issue caused by a single rogue employee, but when the FBI uncovered over $200,000 in stolen goods hidden in a crew storage area and discovered that the ship's security system had been sabotaged with admin codes, they had no choice but to launch a full investigation. 3 months later, I got a call from a federal prosecutor. 11 crew members had been arrested, including 2 supervisors and a guest services manager, all tied to a theft ring that had been operating on multiple ships for years, targeting older passengers carrying expensive gifts for anniversaries or retirements. The cruise line settled quietly, paying far more than what was stolen just to keep us from talking to the press. But of course, that silence didn't last. I was fresh out of high school when my closest friends and I booked a cruise to celebrate graduation. There were 5 of us: Ethan, Claire, Jordan, Emily, and me. We thought a week at sea would be the perfect send-off before college, and responsibility pulled us in different directions. Back then, my life was simple. I worked at a grocery store, stressed over college applications, and felt restless, hungry for something bigger. The cruise was supposed to be that escape, one last taste of freedom before the weight of adulthood. The ship felt like a floating city, bright casinos, all-night buffets, pools stacked on top of each other. We spent the first days running from one thing to another, dizzy with excitement, barely sleeping. But that carefree energy cracked late one night when Lair and I passed a staff corridor near the lower decks. We weren't supposed to be there, but a service stairwell door had been left propped open. That's where we overheard 2 crew members whispering. Their accents were different, but one line came through clearly. "The morgue compartments are already too full." My blood ran cold. A morgue? On a cruise ship? Claire squeezed my arm and whispered, "Did you hear that?" One of the men sighed and replied, "We'll have to mark the rest as medical incidents. No space left." Then they walked away. We told the others, but Ethan laughed, saying every ship had a morgue just in case. Jordan muttered, "Too full? That's not normal." His unease felt contagious. Things got worse a few nights later. Emily got into an argument with a bartender, accusing him of shortchanging her. She wasn't drunk, just stubborn and loud when she thought she'd been wronged. A tall supervisor with slicked back hair stepped in, his face unreadable no matter what Emily said. Eventually the fight fizzled, but Emily muttered she'd report him. That was the last time we saw her. By morning, her bed was empty, her phone still charging on the nightstand, her things untouched. We reported her missing, but the staff acted like they'd rehearsed the response. The supervisor claimed she'd left with friends late at night, even though none of us knew about it. Security promised to check cameras and make announcements, but they never did. Instead, they insisted she must have disembarked at a port. That didn't make sense. Her belongings were all still there. That night, staring at Emily's untouched shoes by the door, Ethan suggested sneaking into restricted areas. At first it sounded like a bad joke, but none of us could ignore the gnawing dread. Jordan charmed a cleaner into explaining where the crew elevators went, and Claire and I timed our chance, slipping in between and runs. The deeper we went, the colder it got. The plush carpet gave way to steel. When the elevator doors opened, the smell hit, industrial cleaner mixed with something sour and metallic. We didn't get far. A man in uniform turned the corner, spotting us immediately. His voice was calm but sharp, asking what we were doing. Claire blurted that we were lost. He didn't scold or threaten, just escorted us back in silence. That silence was worse than anger. When we returned, Ethan and Jordan were pale. They said they overheard crew near the loading bay talking about moving another one before morning. By the next day, rumors were everywhere. Some said a woman had fallen overboard, others claimed a medical evacuation. Nothing matched what we knew. When Jordan pressed security again, they threatened to lock him up for disrupting order. That's when it clicked. Emily wasn't coming back, and whatever was happening was being buried under official excuses. We needed proof. That night, we tried again. Jordan had swiped a room key from a cart, and somehow it worked on the lower levels. Phones ready, flashlights off, we crept down, the air heavy and too quiet. At the end of a corridor, a metal door was cracked open. Ethan pushed it just enough for us to peek inside. Cold drawers lined the walls, toe tags hung from them. Too many. Claire gasped, and the door slammed shut so hard the frame rattled. A shadow moved inside. Someone had been there. We ran without speaking, praying the stolen key still worked. It did. The next morning, security knocked on our door, saying we'd been reported for trespassing. We played dumb, but their stares lingered too long. After that, paranoia ruled. We stuck together, whispered in our cabin, avoided staff. Emily's name never appeared in bulletins. It was like she'd been erased. When the cruise finally ended, we walked off the ship without a word. No one asked questions. No one investigated. Our case was dismissed as a runaway. Even now, I hear those whispers about compartments too full. I see Emily's half-written text glowing on her phone, the one she never finished. We told her parents everything, but without proof, it sounded like paranoia. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the ship counts on people going home too scared, too powerless, too silenced to fight back. I booked that cruise because it was cheap, the only way I could see the world during a break. The ship wasn't fancy, paint-chipped, hallways so narrow you had to squeeze past people. My cabin was tiny, the desk drawer squeaked, the porthole only showed endless gray water. It didn't matter. I thought it was enough. The first night was fine. On the second night, I returned from dinner to find a folded piece of paper on the floor just inside my door. I thought it was a note from housekeeping about towels, but when I opened it, the words were written in shaky block letters. Don't trust the crew. That was it. No name, no explanation. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, like whoever wrote it was in a hurry. I stared at it for minutes, wondering if it was a prank or if it was meant for me. I slid it into my backpack and tried to forget, but the words clung to me. Every time a crew member smiled, I wondered if they knew something. I started noticing details. The bartender who never looked up, the steward who lingered outside cabins too long. By morning, another note appeared under my door. This one said, "They'll deny everything. Stay quiet." That one rattled me more. I finally brought both notes to the purser's desk, hoping someone would take them seriously. Instead, the woman at the counter gave a small laugh, saying, "Passengers often imagine strange things at sea," and told me not to worry. She slid the notes back like she didn't want to touch them at all. Walking away, I felt foolish, like I'd just be brushed off as paranoid, but inside, the warning clung to me. I tried telling myself it was a prank, nothing more. Yet, the ship began to feel different. At breakfast, the student I had spoken to the day before was missing from his usual spot. I thought maybe he had overslept, but at lunch he wasn't there either. By dinner, his seat stayed empty, and no one even mentioned his name. No announcement, no hint that he'd left early. He was simply gone. The following day, the woman I always noticed reading near the pool vanished too. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, always easy to find in the crowd, but her chair stayed untouched, her towel left behind. I walked the deck searching, waiting to see her somewhere else, but she had disappeared like the first man. That was when I began watching the solo travelers more carefully. Some of them just stopped showing up. That night, a third note was shoved under my door. My chest tightened as I opened it. This one read, "You're not next yet. Stay alert." That single word, "yet," echoed in my mind like a bell I couldn't silence. I hardly slept, and every sound in the hallway made me hold my breath, staring at the faint glow under my door, waiting to see if shadows lingered too long. The constant hum of the engines, once calming, now sounded heavy, like a warning I couldn't escape. I tried reporting it again, this time to a different officer, but he dismissed it quickly, saying seasickness could make people restless. He practically pushed me away. I left gripping the notes, feeling stupid yet terrified. If the crew wouldn't believe me, who could I trust? The ship felt huge, but it was closing in on me. Every hallway looked like a trap, every closed door a reminder of the people who were gone. By the fifth day, I stopped pretending it was in my head. The dining hall felt emptier, though no one else admitted it. Families smiled, couples posed for pictures, and the crew acted like nothing was strange. I counted faces, but the missing solo travelers were impossible not to notice. The silence of this. Our absence was louder than laughter. Meals became mechanical, each bite tasteless as my eyes scanned the room. That evening, I spotted 2 crew members leading a young man down a corridor toward a stairwell. I had seen him before, traveling alone. He wasn't drunk, but his steps looked hesitant, like he didn't want to go. When he glanced back, his face struck me. Fear and resignation mixed together, like he wanted to speak, but knew it wouldn't matter. Then the crew guided him around the corner. Gone. That was the moment I knew the notes weren't just warnings. They were the truth. That night, I locked myself inside my cabin, dragging the desk and chair against the door. Every creak in the hallway froze my chest. No new note came, but that only made it worse. The silence felt heavier than the words ever had. I didn't sleep until dawn. Light touched the ocean through the porthole. 2 days later, the ship docked, and I rushed off with only my backpack, my lungs tight until my feet touched solid ground. To this day, I don't know what became of those missing people. There were no reports, no news, nothing afterward. It was as if they had been erased. I still keep those 3 notes in a notebook at home, the handwriting smeared where I gripped them too hard. Sometimes I wonder why the writer chose to warn me at all. Maybe I was lucky, or maybe I was seconds away from being the next passenger no one ever mentioned again. I signed up for that cruise because it was the cheapest deal my friends and I could find. Honestly, it seemed like the kind of reckless trip college kids should take. We weren't chasing luxury, just a chance to be out at sea, squeezed into a small cabin, splitting costs, pretending we were adults on vacation. I remember the ship looked older than I expected when we boarded. The paint was faded, the railings already rusting, but we laughed it off. Back then, the only thought in my head was how unreal it felt to be sailing away from assignments and campus noise with my friends. The first 2 days passed in dull rhythm, sun, packed buffets, random small talk with strangers. Most of the time, I stuck close to Leah, my roommate for the trip. She had this restless energy, always dragging me across decks, pointing out how the sky never looked quite clear even when others were sunbathing. She kept saying it felt like something was building. I shrugged, assuming she was overthinking. We were young, sure nothing bad could touch us at sea. But everything changed on the 3rd night. Dinner had barely ended when an announcement crackled from the speakers, cutting through the noise. The captain's voice was calm but sharp, telling us a storm had turned unexpectedly. It wasn't supposed to come near our route, but now it was heading straight for us. At first, people laughed nervously, but as the crew started passing instructions with stiff faces, the tension grew quickly. Leah gave me a pointed look like she had been right all along, and for the first time, the air on the ship felt thick with fear. By midnight, the ship wasn't gliding anymore. It was groaning. Each wave slammed into us like a giant hand trying to shove the whole ship onto its side. The halls tilted, dishes shattered somewhere deep below, and the walls rattled like they might tear apart. The lights flickered again and again until finally they cut out completely, leaving hundreds of passengers stumbling in pure darkness. All around me was the sound of water rushing where it didn't belong and the groan of metal straining against forces far too strong. I gripped the railing outside our cabin so tightly that my hands went numb, sure the next hit would split the ship in 2. Leah and I tried moving toward the stairwell, but the floor jerked so violently that we met into the walls more than once. Voices echoed everywhere in the dark, some people calling for their families, others just screaming whenever the ship jolted. A crew member rushed past us with a flashlight, yelling orders that were drowned under the roar of waves hammering the hull. For a moment, I smelled the ocean before I even felt it, salt water seeping under the doors, rushing across the carpeted floor faster than we could move. We finally reached a railing near one of the open decks, clutching it alongside dozens of strangers who all shared the same frozen look of fear. The ship leaned so far that the horizon outside looked like a wall, a tower of water higher than anything I thought could exist. Every crash made the steel beneath us shriek, like the vessel itself was crying. I clutched Leah's arm so hard she winced, but neither of us dared to let go. That railing felt like the only thing keeping us real, keeping us alive. The blackout dragged on, broken only by weak emergency lights that flickered in and out, never bright enough to show more than shadows. Alarms wailed in uneven bursts deeper in the ship, then cut out without warning, leaving an even heavier silence. My mind kept circling back to how none of the safety drills had prepared us for this, for standing blind in the dark while the sea tossed us like a toy. Every second stretched endlessly, every shudder of the ship a reminder that the ocean could crush us at any moment. Time twisted in that chaos until it stopped meaning anything. At some point, Leah whispered that we weren't going to make it out alive, and I couldn't argue. I pressed my head against the icy railing and just listened to the sea pound and retreat, like it was counting down the seconds to the end. My thoughts scattered between my parents, the stupid choice to save money on this trip, and the fact that no one on land had the slightest idea of what was happening to us in that moment. When the storm finally broke, it wasn't a gentle calm. It felt like the ocean took one long exhale. The violent shudders softened into dull tremors. The crashing became uneasy ripples, and then, for the first time in hours, silence covered the decks. Emergency lights came back to life, revealing pale faces and clothes drenched through. Strangers clung to each other like wreck survivors, even though the ship was somehow still afloat. When I finally released the railing, I was shocked my arm even worked, every muscle frozen stiff from holding on for so long. The crew began guiding us back inside, though the hallways were already filled ankle-deep with seawater. Doors hung crooked, belongings floated by like trash drifting through a flooded basement. Leah and I staggered back to our cabin to find the beds flipped, ceiling tiles sagging with water, and the whole place smelling like salt and diesel so sharp it burned in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes that night. I just sat upright in the wrecked room, waiting for the ship to shudder again. By morning, we were told the storm had twisted so fast that the captain had no choice but to face it head-on. Some passengers called him reckless, others praised him as a hero. None of that mattered to me. All I cared about was that the ship had barely survived and that I had stared into the ocean at its worst and lived through it. I remember stepping out on deck as the sun rose, the horizon soft and golden as though the nightmare hours before had been imagined. But the twisted railings and broken windows were proof that it had been real. Even now, years later, I can still feel that night whenever I hear strong winds outside my apartment, or pass a building creaking in a storm. It's not just the memory of fear, it's the helplessness, the truth that you are at the mercy of something far bigger than yourself. That trip was supposed to be carefree and cheap, just a silly college memory. Instead, it left me with something I can never erase. The memory of clinging to cold metal in total darkness, waiting for the sea itself to decide whether I lived or not,